So good morning. It is a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm actually going to hit on a third topic while I'm here, and towards the end of the discussion, I'll give you a quick update on where we are as far as the PMT and the PMT process and so forth. So I've got quite a few slides, and I know listening to the previous speakers, there's been some discussions or questions on nutrient management, so I'm going to try to quickly get through these slides, and then I'm sure there's going to be a number of questions. So, all right. So whenever I give a talk about nutrient management, and it doesn't matter what area of nutrient management there is, I think it's important to define what nutrient management is. And here we recognize that it incorporates both production agriculture and urban lawn care, promoting the balance between maximum production and environmental stewardship. You know, you don't have to, they're not so far apart that they can't work together. And in today's world, when we have new technology and new genetics, it's more of, better efficiencies with our crops and being able to utilize those efficiencies to grow bigger crops to supply a adequate food source for our daily lives. So I'm going to start right into this. In the winter of 2015, spring of 2016, the Department of Agriculture was receiving quite a few phone calls from livestock growers, biosolids and food waste companies, from municipalities, concerns about some new regulations that were going to be going into effect July 1st of 2016. And what those regulations stated was that there would be no spreading of manure or other regulated nutrients on the western shore from November 15th to March 1st, and on the eastern shore from November 1st to March 1st. There was also, or I should say, a lack of language in the new provisions or in the new regulations that allowed for emergency spreading, an emergency spreading provision. And we felt, as from the department standpoint, that we certainly need to address this area. So the main concerns really came from liquid waste, whether it was liquid manure and liquid food waste, liquid municipal waste, but the lack of storage. And when these regulations were adopted back in 2012, the thought was it would give all these different interest groups time enough to create enough storage so that we would be prepared for the July 1st, 2016, when these regulations would go into effect. But you're talking about a massive undertaking, both from the resources from these various different interest groups, in this case the farmers or the municipalities or companies that deal with food waste, but the resources that particularly farmers who reach out to our local soil conservation offices, who look for technical assistance to help implement these practices, to put these storage units on the ground. It takes a good year plus to not only to do the design and then the construction, lining up, those companies that are going to be able to construct these storage storage containers. There was some concern also from, particularly from the farming community, with the mild falls and winters that we've had, on having some allowances for applying within those restricted dates when the weather conditions were adequate. Concerns that, again, from a storage standpoint, they felt like they wanted to be able to apply and not risk having an overflow amongst from their containers. And again, the department had this concern about not having an emergency provision. So the department, we have a nutrient advisory committee that the governor has set up, has various different representatives from various different interest groups, from the farming community, from the animal industry, we have from the environmental community, we have representatives from a couple different state agencies, all come together to address, one, to look at what progress the nutrient management program has been making in the last year, and then to also address what the concerns are out there in the field and how we may move forward into trying to address those concerns. So we met in May of 2016 to discuss these concerns. We asked our interested parties that were raising these concerns to bring their concerns to the meeting and address the committee. From there, the advisory committee had recommended to the department to look further into this and come up with some recommendations. So it wasn't just one of the tasks that we took from the department was we want to be as transparent as we possibly can. So we reached out to various different ag groups, the environmental groups, our agencies folks, and talk about what can we do to alleviate or to address these concerns. We did that in a short period of time in June, and then we brought back the advisory committee back in July of 2016, proposed 3 changes to the regulations. Those regulations, once we passed through that committee, went through a process where it was introduced to the Secretary of Agriculture, on to the governor, then on to the AELR committee, and then by January 2017, those proposals were adopted. So the changes that we introduced, one was changing those spreading dates. Instead of having 2 sets of spreading dates, have 1 set for the state. And we looked at, the dates we chose were from December 16th to March 1st. We had reached out, one of our other partners that we work with is the University of Maryland, because a lot of our recommendations through our nutrient management come from the recommendations from the university. So we had reached out to the university for their feedback. We also reached out to other states particularly north of us, where climates are a lot cooler, to find out what kind of restrictions that they had on spreading dates. We added emergency spreading provision to allow for winter spreading of farm-generated manure, those farms that did not have adequate storage. And there's some restrictions in that provisions that I'm going to get to in a minute. And then the third provision, or third change in regulations, we've heard this morning, we just heard about soil health. And there's one of the components of soil health is reducing or eliminating soil disturbance. And up to that point, we had a requirement that any manure or biosolids and so forth that is spread on the land is required to be incorporated. And we had heard concerns from the farming community for farmers who had a continuous no-till system that they objected to taking a disc or taking some sort of vertical tillage equipment and going out and disturbing the soil. It went completely against what their program as far as soil health and their continuous no-till. So, but we also added into those provisions that if a farmer was not in a continuous no-till practice, that he would be required to incorporate that manure within 48 hours. We also added in some other restrictions or requirements. If a farmer did not have adequate storage and he's requesting an emergency provision, the first step he must do is contact the Department of Agriculture and follow our guidance to where and when he can apply that manure. He must also he or she must also reach out to the local soil conservation district offices and make arrangements to sit down with them to address their need for adequate storage, for additional storage. We also put in restrictions that if there was a need for winter spreading, that we would observe a 100-foot setback from any surface water, and that any manure would be applied on vegetative crop. What we've seen and we feel is that this also helps prevent an overflow of storage of any manure or waste products overflowing, because that is absolutely the last thing we want to see. And since the adoption of the previous regulation in 2012, farmers, particularly the dairy farmers, have been working feverishly with the Department of Agriculture through our max cost share program and through our technical service providers working with NRCS, trying to put in additional storage. And working with all those resources is very time consuming. The other thing to keep in mind is if you may or may not know, the dairy industry has been in pretty dire straits these last few years because of low milk prices. And When we're cost sharing on these practices, the farmers have skin in the game. They're putting, in some cases, as Taryn had mentioned, they could be putting in anywhere from 15% up to 50% of their own funds into putting these storage facilities in. And these storage facilities are not cheap. They can cost you well over $200,000. And these storage facilities, in many cases, must meet a CAFO permit. They must meet standards and specifications through NRCS. We also feel that, with the when the farms are calling into the department requesting this exemption, if we feel that we can closely monitor these farms to make sure that they are putting the manure where it needs to be, that we're addressing where the needs are and trying to direct the districts on where to focus their resources. And we noticed in the last year, we had far fewer complaints. We got quite a few more phone calls from the farmers who want to work with the department. One of the other, or a couple of the other restrictions that we also put in place as we were going through these regulations, even during outside those restricted dates of December 15th to March 1st, we put in there provisions that farmers cannot spread on frozen ground, snow-covered ground, or saturated ground. And we also put in a provision that a farmer could not apply utilizing these products more than 50 pounds of N in the fall. So how do we get out to the farmers and to the ag community what the changes are as far as in the nutrient management law? So we work very closely with the Maryland Extension Service through our newsletters, through our websites, social media, through our agronomy days that take place across the state all year long, making sure the farmers are aware that what the changes are. We have numerous training sessions throughout the state. We have training sessions just about every month that farmers and consultants can go to update their training, make sure that they have their vouchers are up to date. The main thing is we want to make sure from the department standpoint that farmers and the ag community understand what mandated, all who fall under mandated nutrient management are abiding by the law, that they understand what a nutrient management is and what their allowances are, and just to make sure that no over-application takes place. So this kind of leads me into preparing for a nutrient management audit. And as Sarah said, we're not out there to get you. This is not a gotcha moment. What this is we have 9 specialists, well, actually we're down to 6. We've had some staffing turnover. But we have right now 6 ag specialists, and we have 2 urban specialists who go out in the field, who meet with the farmers, who sit down and review their nutrient management plans, review their records to make sure that they're in compliance with nutrient management. We want to make sure that that the nutrient applicators, both from the agricultural sector and the urban lawn care, are in compliance. So what's the first step? So there's a selection method, and it can be from a variety of different things. It could be a random selection, or it could be a targeted selection. And if it's a target, it's usually a response to a complaint, a follow-up from a previous review. It could be to address some concerns that when the AIR, the annual implementation report that farmers are required to send in every year, it could be addressed from some concerns that we noticed on those reports. So again, it could be either a random inspection or it could be targeted. Our specialists will reach out to the farmers and through a phone call, through letters, making sure that to set up a date and a time where they can come in and sit down. Requirements from the operator for this evaluation or this inspection or audit must provide the current nutrient management plan for that year and the 2 previous years. And the specialist is going to randomly select which year's programs or multi-year program plans that he's going to look into, and he's going to randomly select certain fields to look at what the nutrient management plan requires and what the records of what the farmer had applied on the ground, and also the fertilizer receipts. So as I said, they're going to select random fields. The specialist is going to double check the calculations on the phosphorus site index tool or the phosphorus management tool calculations to verify that the recommendations are accurate. And then also they'll go over the copy of the, and at the end of the evaluation, the specialist will provide an evaluation report to the farmer and sit down with the farmer and explain what the specialist had found, whether he was in compliance or not. Again, a copy of 1 or 3 years of plans. The specialist is going to be looking at what types of nutrients were applied to the land, the dates and the locations of where those nutrients were applied. And usually a farmer will have every field separated and for his records to shows what nutrients were applied on that specific field. Because in a nutrient management plan, your plan is separated by fields or various different sections. Some farmers use precision ag, and their plans get in quite more specific, more detailed than, say, just a plan that represents a whole field. From a manure standpoint, we want to know what kind of manure was applied, the date it was removed from the storage or production area, the name of the receiver, of where that manure is being stored, and we also need to know what the yield information per field over the last 5 years, so that we want to make sure that the yield goals in the plan are adequate. So again, I know I'm probably repeating myself, but there's generally a general discussion with the farmer to talk about his practices on the farm. The specialist is going to be looking at specific things within the plan, the field ID, the acreage, the crop grown, yield goals. He's going to be looking at where the soil test was taken. A farmer's required to soil test once every 3 years. But as in our reviews, when we go out and meet with farmers, majority of farmers out there are doing soil tests every year. And then we're also looking at what the recommendations from a nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So this form and the next 2 slides are really slides of what that evaluation form is looking at. As it was mentioned earlier, I think Allison had said, to be required to have a nutrient management plan, you either need to generate $2,500 or have 8 animal units. And those are some of the very first questions that are asked on this form. And then the inspector or the specialist will be looking, again, he'll take some random fields. He'll be looking at those recommendations, making sure that the calculations are accurate. And at the end of the form, he'll sign off. The farmer will sign off, and then they'll sit down and talk about what the findings were. So again, comparing what the recommendations are in the plan versus what the application rates were applied, and making sure that those rates were fit within the MDA standards. We want to make sure that the applicator has a nutrient management voucher card. Nutrients applied within the standards will earn you a written, nutrients that are above the MDA standards could earn you a warning. And I'm going to get a little bit into what the process of from warnings to fines to collections. A warning could become from an expired or incomplete plan. It could be looking at the yield goals, improper yield goals, inadequate manure management records, or improper timing of manure or nutrient application. Nitrogen has a little bit of wiggle room, I should say. You're allowed up to 10 pounds over what your plan says. Phosphorus is a little more variable. If you're above your 150 fertility index value, standard will be what was justified through the PSI or the PMT tool within the nutrient management plan. That's your limit. If you're below 150 and you're using an organic source of fertilizer, there is no phosphorus limit. However, if you're using commercial fertilizer, allowances are what the phosphorus recommendations were out of the nutrient management manual for that crop and yield goal within that soil test range. Or commercial fertilizers can be allowed up to crop removal. It can be very confusing. I know the farmers and the consultants who go out and they get trained, some cases it's a 3-day training, it's a lot of hours. You need to, farmers and consultants need to be retrained in some cases every year, some cases every 3 years to make sure that they understand the rules because it is a very complicated process. All right, a warning can be given for an incomplete or an expired nutrient management plan. Again, improper yield goals, inadequate manure records, and those warnings are good for 90 days, and the farmer's given 90 days to correct that, and if he's corrected it within that time frame, the warning is resolved. However, if it's still incorrect after 90 days, this could lead to a charge or to a fine, and then the operation will be out of compliance with nutrient management until it's corrected. Warnings for over-application are a little different. They're held in limbo. Our specialists will reach out within the year, go back out to the farm and sit down to make sure that the next crop, the farmer is staying within the guidelines of the nutrient management plan. And once he is, that warning will be resolved. These operations are not necessarily considered to be out of compliance during this nutrient period. If the actions are not resolved within the second inspection, then we consider that farm out of compliance, and then you're going to a fine. If you're out of compliance, farmers are not available to take cost share funds through our max cost share program, such as our cover crop and our manure transport. So farmers must stay in compliance if you're going to be able to receive those funds. So when we go from a warning, which is issued at the review, the next step could be a charge if the issues are not addressed. It could be a $250 fine for not having a nutrient management plan or expired plan. We could have a $100 violation for not implementing a nutrient management plan. And we have a limit of $2,000 per year. These fines are not set by the department. They're set within the Agricultural Article 803-1. And if those issues are still not resolved, then we go to a default decision order and then collections. And once it goes to that, it's out of our hands. The farmer still must, not only does he have to pay the fine, but there's no means to appeal to the secretary. So once it goes to collections, it's out of our hands. And just to give you an idea of where we are with compliance, in 2017, we ran 116 random audits, and about 61% of those audits were in compliance. The balance were either through expired plans, incomplete plans, no plans, or over application. And those farms, we will go back and we will reach out to those farms on a second second audit and sit down with those farmers and make sure that those farms are following compliance regulations. So the last part of my talk, I want to just give you a brief update on where we are with the phosphorus management tool. And I apologize, I can read the numbers. You may not, but I think I can. In the state, we have about almost 1.3 million acres that are required, that are regulated. Farmers are required to send in data, their AIR reports every year on those acres. One of the tasks that the department was given was collecting all the phosphorus soil data on all the fields across the state that fall within the regulated nutrient management plan. To date, we've collected about almost 86% of those acres, 1.1 million acres. And our goal has always been to be at 100%. So our consultants, our specialists are reaching out to the consultants, are reaching out to the farmers and sitting down. And this past year, we made it more of a targeted, with the data that was missing, we made it more of a targeted choice to go out and do, not only to collect this data, but also to do an evaluation or an audit. Out of that 86% of the data collected, 80% of the acres across the state fall below the 150 FIV. And if you're under the 150 FIV, the PMT does not kick in. To the far right, anything over an FIV of 500, and these are acres that cannot, since July 1st of 2015, those fields cannot have any phosphorus through commercial or organic source being applied to those fields. And from the state's, from looking at the state, we have about almost 1.5% of the acres. And granted, the majority of the acres are on the lower shore. And I think I should make a note here that before we had this data, there was an assumption out there that 80% of the shore, of the eastern shore, had high phosphorus soils, and that 40% of the soils on the western shore had high phosphorus soils. And until we had this data, we really didn't know. And that information really came from a modeling exercise as we were running the PMT to make sure that the PMT was working. And those soil samples were used from areas where we had high concentrations of livestock. But once we had this data, we got a much better handle on where the high phosphorus is and how much there is and how we can address our resources moving forward. So next year is when farmers are going to have to start implementing or transitioning, I should say transition first, into towards the PMT for those high phosphorus soils. So we're going to address the very high farms or fields first. So what consultants were required to do was send to the department an average for each farmer who had a high P soil, the average FIV above 150 for that farmer. So if a farmer had an average FIV over his fields that had high P above 450, those farming operations are going to have to first transition towards the PMT. Now, that may include fields that are below the 450, somewhere in the 150 to 450. But we're addressing first the farm operations where they have where the higher average of those fields are above 450. The second transition will be in 2020. We'll be collecting a few more acres, and then the kick is in 2020. In 2020, I should say, is when the majority of those acres will start the transition. Part of the PMT is also looking at manure transport and how we're addressing and how we're moving that manure from where it cannot be applied to where it can be applied. So through our manure transport program, and I've just got the data here from the last 5 years, we've moved about almost close to 800,000 tons of litter. Of manure. Now, the majority of that manure is actually dairy manure. So this program works both for all manures, and this is again utilized to cost share to move that manure where farmers can't apply it to where farmers can. Also, this program is also used to moving manure for alternative uses. And it's pretty popular on the eastern shore for the litter, where we're moving a lot of the litter up to mushroom farms up into Pennsylvania. And then the third area of the PMT is our technology, or animal waste technology update. And what we're looking at is looking at proven technologies. This is not research. Looking at proven technologies, working with farmers, working with companies, having a site-specific identified where we can put these technologies in place, and looking to address nitrogen and phosphorus reduction and improving manure management for those operations. These operations or these companies that we're working with need to have a track record of at least 3 years. And today in FY14, we approved 4 projects, 2 poultry, a horse, and a dairy operation, looking at compost, anywhere from composting to anaerobic digestion to fluidized bed combustion. And then in 2016, we awarded 2 other projects in looking at, again, alternative uses. And we've also right now have an RFP out there now looking for any other types of projects that might be, may work for this project. So that pretty much hits my presentation. I'm sure there's probably a lot of questions.
Thank you, Hans. I want to thank the Department of Agriculture, too, for supporting the regulations as well as they have. Also, I want to just to keep in mind that the agreement that we have with the Maryland Department of Agriculture and the College of Agricultural and Natural Resources supports the consultants, the nutrient management advisors, in each one of the extension offices, at least at the half or full-time level. And sometimes we underestimate the amount of money that entwines. And that is that, if you value that hour of $55 for each one of those consultants sitting in a chair, and then you go out in the private sector where farmers are getting they're paying a private consultant, it really is a lot of money behind the scenes that supports this effort. And, I hear stories now that in the private sector, some of these plans are costing somewhere around $1,500 to $2,000 for some of our larger farmers. And it's still being supported by Maryland Department of Agriculture and the College of Ag and Natural Resources for free when they come to the extension office and do that. So I want to commend that and let everyone know how important that is and vital that is to our citizens.
Thank you, Dave. I mean, we certainly want to make sure that the resources are out there for farmers, that they can reach out and make sure that they have a current nutrient management plan. A number of the funds, in fact, majority of the funds that come through the department are actually federal funds, EPA grants that we can utilize to reach out to send to the university to put those nutrient management writers out in the field. And I'll say this right now, I mean, we have some concerns with what's going on in Washington, the concerns of the funding and so forth, and making sure that we want those funds to continue, because it is desperately needed out in the fields. As Dave said, some of these, for some farmers who are working through private consultants, some of these plans can be pretty costly. And so we want to make sure that the resources are there for farmers to use.
I'm on my way. You fell just on this side, so you get me, not Sarah.
Yes, good morning. This is just an observation and perhaps a question. I noticed that of the 4 funded programs, 1 to Days End Farm, Horse Farm, that is to a 501c3 charitable organization, which obviously by definition is nonprofit and is not required to turn a profit. I'm wondering, does the department take into consideration in funding these grants whether or not it's a for-profit organization, and if not, why not?
I don't know if I can answer your question adequately. When I've been in the department for just almost 2 years, and we have a staff on board that focus primarily just on these new types of technology projects. They review the RFPs, they look at what projects are going to work, what they feel are going to work. Because our main concern is looking at how we can repurpose litter or manure, and looking at some other type of outcome to reduce nutrients in that material. To address your question, I think I'm not going to answer it. I can say that I can get back with you and get the answers for you.
Hi, can you hear me?
I'm sorry.
Great, okay, oh, there we go. Hi, I'm a consultant for a nutrient management consultant, and I've been working with a number of very small, diversified, primarily vegetable farms. And a lot of the farmers have found implementing the regulations onerous in terms of calculating, for example, if they've got an acre in production and most every bed is a different type of crop, and they're having to calculate nutrient application rates for each of those crops. So that's something we can do to some extent in the plans that are provided. But I was wondering if there's been any discussion internally about making the implementation of these plans a little bit less onerous for small diversified farms.
To be specific to your question, no. We look at, and again, we reach out to the university for their recommendations. We have laws and guidelines that we have to follow. It is certainly something that we can look into, but to this point, we have not addressed that.
Joanne Ivancic with Advanced Biofuels USA out of Frederick. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the developments in the Maryland Nutrient Management Credit Trading Program, and could farmers who might exceed the baseline on their farms and still do management practices be eligible for getting credits for that environmentally beneficial work that they're doing?
So there's been a lot of discussion in dealing with nutrient management credits and nutrient trading and so forth. Department of Agriculture has had some regulations into place, but we haven't had any trades. The Department of Environment has actually just put their regulations, I believe right now, they're at the AELR committee right now being reviewed. But to address your question, we have had some discussions as far as, litter that has been repurposed to reduce the nutrient load, on whether there can be any credits that can be generated and can be sold to outfits that need the credits. And all those details are trying to be worked out right now, and we're hoping that probably in the next few months we'll have something more detailed that we'll be able to present to you.
Going once. There we have.
I just have I'm curious. You have 6 people working for you to oversee how thousands, maybe like 10 to 12,000 farms, to make sure that they're following these programs. And I was also curious, if the fine is only $250, is that the same for a huge farm as opposed to a little farm? Because, if the really big farm is not following the nutrient management plan, they're going to be polluting substantially more that's going into the environment than a little farm. And $100 and $250 just doesn't sound like a huge fine. So, and then it maxes out at $2,000. So if you're a huge farm, livestock, $2,000 seems kind of paltry. Not poultry.
I understand your question and your concerns. And as I said earlier, we don't set the fines. I believe it would have to go through General Assembly. There's a process that it would have to go through to change those fines. We only abide by what our limitations are. Back to your first question as far as the number of inspectors that we have. At the beginning of the year, we had 9. And as I said earlier, we've had a little bit of changeover. We had some retirements. We had a couple people who had changed jobs. And so there's a process that we have to follow to try to refill, and our goal is to fill those positions back up. Our goal is to, and we have about 5,200 regulated farms that fall under regulated nutrient management plan requirements that we have to, that we'll go out and inspect. And our goal is to reach out to 20% of those farms. So you're looking at once every 5 years, going out and inspecting those farms. So again, we're dealing with the resources that we have, because when an inspector goes out and reviews a farm, in many cases, it could be a half a day take a half a day to go out, look at the records, and in some cases, the inspector will go out, actually out on the field and look at the fields. So it's very time-consuming to go out there. So it's not a real quick where you go in, you're only in there for an hour, and then you leave. It does take time to make that, to do that process.
So I think we're at time for the panel. If you'd thank me in thanking Hans, please.